Hello, adventurer. It's good to see you. You have made it to the morning grind.
Welcome, welcome.
It's the live stream at the beginning of the Geekverse, where we talk about all types of topics in geekdom, gaming, and fantasy, with an emphasis on being constructive and creating the things that we want to exist in the world.
It's all on the grind, Sizemore. Can't be too fine, can't be too coarse.
That's exactly right. There are a lot of adventures to be had today. Dungeons to explore and monsters to slay, and who knows what a random encounter might send our way. That's why we have to prepare, so settle in now for the morning grind with your favorite beverage in hand.
Tea? Or maybe something a little stronger. I've got a few bottles of the old Wynyard left.
Whatever you want. Pull up a chair.
Dude.
If you're feeling fancy, how about a cappuccino? Or a frappuccino? Or how about an espresso?
Just tea, thank you.
Sounds good to me, Gandalf. Whatever you want. I'm just glad you're here.
Everyone is welcome. You can just watch if you want. You don't have to worship anything you don't want to worship.
Thank you, Mike. But be forewarned.
Sometimes we get really strange characters around here.
Wait, what's that you say? Why can't you come and be a part of the stream?
My wife would disown me.
Oh no, I bet she'll be fine with it. Come on in.
Am I scared for my safety? No.
What are we supposed to do?
Everybody do the secret handshake.
Secret cultist handshake.
Oh, now do wizards who love each other.
This, my friend, is a science.
I still don't have gifts, but it's fine.
It's all on the grind, son. Can't be too fine, can't be too coarse.
Dude, this would be a sick place to bring the band.
Indeed it would be, Dave. It really would. I'm seeing more people coming in. Welcome, glad to have you here. Oh, look, here's someone new.
Is this the cultist meetup?
Yes it is.
Come to hang out? Please accept me. I have nothing else.
Okay, we accept you. Everyone's welcome here.
Brought some snacks.
Well, that makes things even better.
You want some coffee? I don't drink coffee. You sure? It's cultist coffee. What makes it cultist coffee? I'm a cultist and I'm drinking it. Oh. Then I'll have some.
What exactly is going on here?
I'm seeing more people coming in. Welcome. It's so great to have you. Oh, and look, here comes another stranger.
Can we help you?
Yes, fellow cultists. I could really use some food.
Oh, yeah? Welcome. We have donuts.
Oh, it's me. I'm glad I'm here. I'm sure you have a few questions for me, though.
What's your name? Who do you work for? What god do you worship?
Great questions, Rob.
I'm Steve King, and I worship Nyarlathotep.
No, not really. I'm just Heath, and I won't be worshiping anything this morning. But I will be your host. Welcome to the office. We're going to have a great time. I've got my coffee ready, because now it's time for the morning grind.
If you could become a fish, that would be amazing. Then I could command you with my mental fish powers.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the morning grind. I am here in the office again this morning. I was working on the Ravivania World Primer, specifically character classes this morning. So I was trying to get some character classes in there. Now, I noticed there's a problem with the World Primer I've been working on. It seems like my word target might have actually been too much, because I've been going in and trying to add some, add in the actual character classes. I've still got to add in some more NPC numbers, and I had come up with last time that, I should probably add in some information about equipment. And by the time I'm doing that, it looks like I might be exceeding my 48 pages, and I haven't even put in art yet. So I'm going to finish up typing up what should be there, but then I might have to go through another major edit phase to figure out what needs to be dropped in order to make the 48-page book. So that's what I was doing this morning. Yesterday, actually, I was not getting work done yesterday. It was kind of a slow day. It was I was intending to do a whole lot of work yesterday so that I could break and go and see John Wick today. But my day was just not going all that great yesterday as far as productivity goes. It was kind of just a slow, kind of meandering day. So I decided to do something very uncharacteristic. And so yesterday, what I did is decided to go and see John Wick 4 yesterday afternoon. It takes a while to get to a movie theater from where I am. And so it's kind of a big commitment, especially since that was such a long movie. But I just decided, you know what? Instead of trying to do that today, I'm going to dedicate the rest of today after the morning grind to cutting grass, cleaning up outside, cleaning the inside of the house. And I'm just going to do completely physical cleaning activities and stuff like that today. That way I don't have to break to go and see John Wick this afternoon. So I did go and see John Wick 4. Has anybody else seen it? I think Sable Phoenix was talking about seeing it yesterday. Also going and seeing it yesterday. So maybe we'll be able to get to talk about John Wick 4 with someone, maybe on a table talk, maybe sometime else. I have a theory that about John Wick's relationship to Beauty and the Beast. So maybe Doug Burton would be a good one to talk to about that. So I almost said, you know what, should I make this a double feature since I'm already here and go and see the Dungeons and Dragons movie as well? But it was still so late by the time I was out of John Wick, I decided no. I almost did it. I don't know if I've heard different things about the Dungeons and Dragons movie. As you can see, I've got different things about like analyzing the trailer and things like that. And I kind of thought that a Dungeons and Dragons movie was unnecessary. But it would be nice if it were good. It would be nice if it were good. When I walked into the movie theater actually yesterday, I saw that one of the local game shops was set up with Dungeons and Dragons stuff at a table, trying to talk to people, I guess, as they're coming out of the D&D movie. So I hope it's good. Hope it's good. I'll have to see whether I go see it or not. Okay, so hi, Micah. Let's see who we got here. Micah is here. Good morning. Got food. Excellent. Stargate Mind. Good morning. Good morning. James Bacon's one of our channel members. Thank you so much, James. James is here. As well as Zero the Blade, another channel member. Good morning. Micah has been doing a lot of work today. Micah's been working on an RPG as well. So, excellent. So, formula's written up and solid, and now it's time for playtesting. Zero Theory is here. Good morning. Yep. Micah's, remember, please do hit the thumbs up button, everybody, if you're here, or if the algorithm has brought you here, please do also subscribe. That would be great. Micah has not seen any of the John Wick movies yet. I did see that. Oh, you did. So they did enjoy the D&D movie. So the D&D movie was good. All right. So we got one vote for the D&D movie. Neutromancer says, good morning. Good morning. James says, I've heard that generally D&D is good and that John Wick is probably the best action movie ever put to film. It's over ambitious and shouldn't work, but it does. I really like the first John Wick. I've liked the entire series of John Wick, but I really like the first John Wick. I've still got to think more about this fourth one. It was great. It was good. It was definitely good. And John Wick is able to do something with its franchise that a lot of other franchises are not able to do, which is consistently deliver movies that its fans like. You got to give it extreme props for that. Lassie Borley, welcome. Good morning. Welcome to the Morning Grind. It is fantastic to have you here. Zero the Blade says, been hearing mixed reviews of the D&D movie, but all say it's decent. Okay, well, that's good. That's good. I might have to go and see it. I wasn't planning on going to see it. And like I said, getting to the movie theater is tough. John Wick will get me to the movie theater. The Dungeons and Dragons movie is questionable. Good morning, Patrick. Good morning, Patrick. Okay, so our topic today is this Jaquaying a dungeon, right? And we talked about that the other day when we were talking about dungeon design, because we looked at the AD&D Dungeon Builder's Guide book briefly, just one episode, and it wasn't even, it was kind of a short episode because I had to go and have lunch with family. But really, the cyclical dungeon design, we did an episode on cyclical dungeon design, and I thought that was fantastic. I thought that was a really great theory of dungeon design. Oh, we got Mark's genre mixer says, saw D&D last night, and it was a fun popcorn movie. Not necessarily the high quality elegance of, well, I wasn't expecting that. Yeah, I was not, it would be great if we could come up with like a Forgotten Realms series that was like the Lord of the Rings, but that's just not what they're going to do. So we were taking a look at cyclical dungeon design, but it was recommended. I had never heard this term before. This term, actually, right over here, Jaquaying a dungeon, which is part of our dungeon design or possible philosophical approaches to designing a dungeon. And I had never heard this term before, but I went over here to, this is the Alexandrian that has this blog post about it. And I was like, okay, well, we should probably get into this and figure out what our philosophy of dungeon design is. And so I figure out what this is, because I just barely skimmed by it the other day when it was brought up on the morning grind. And so I thought, okay, let's actually get into this and figure out what this is. So this is, this is from a while ago. I can't believe I've never heard of this term. Jaquaying the dungeon. I believe that dungeons should always be heavily jackwayed. Okay, it's true. I'm just making up words now. In the case of Jaquaying, the term is referring to Jackaways, who designed Caverns of Thracia, Dark Tower, Griffin Mountain, and a half a dozen other old-school classics for the Judges Guild, Chaosium, Flying Buffalo, and TSR before transitioning into video game design. In the latter capacity, she recently wrote some essays on maps that she designed for Halo Wars. Memorable game maps spring from a melding of design of intent and fortunate accidents. Jackaways. Crevice Design Notes. That's timeless advice and design ethos, and a design ethos which extends beyond the RTS level she helped design for Halo Wars and reaches back to her earliest work. When Jackways particularly excelled at those early Judges Guild modules, what Jackways particularly excelled at in those early Judges Guild modules was non-linear dungeon design, which I think is going to be a big part of this. Stargate Mind says, over the course of this course of a game, there are 6 encounter theory that works perfectly with this design tool. General Nut says, not sure if Forgotten Realms movie to feel like Lord of the Rings is possible. It's just not as believable a world. You can still take the material seriously, though. What I was talking about is taking the material seriously to actually create a serious story in a serious movie. Oh, are we buffering or something? Let me make sure it's not on my end. Oh, I do see that I just got a little bit of an unstable connection at the moment. Maybe it'll clear up here in just a moment. So, for example, the Caverns of Thracia, Jackways, includes 3 separate entrances to the first level of the dungeon. And from level 1 of the dungeon, you will find 2 conventional paths and no less than 8 unconventional paths or secret paths leading down to lower levels. And level 2 is where things start to get really interesting. The result is a fantastically complex and dynamic environment. You can literally run dozens of groups through this module, and every one of them will have a fresh and unique experience. And I kind of think that that's one of the advantages of having something, I think, like a unique, like a standard dungeon that a lot of people go through, because then you do have a common experience and you can discuss that with one another. Like the adventurers would be discussing things at a tavern, but that means that other players can actually be discussing things about, oh, yeah, I did that one. We did this. We found our way through it this way. We found our way through it that way. And there's actually something to discuss. I mean, you can certainly discuss, oh yeah, our game master created this completely new thing over here, and our game master, and let me tell you about it, so cool. And our game master, made something completely different. Let me tell you about it, it's so cool. But it is nice sometimes to have a common referent for a discussion when we are talking about, all trying to go through some type of adventure and how we did it, or how we were successful or how we weren't successful. But there's more value here than just recycling an old module. That same dynamic flexibility, which allows multiple groups to have unique experiences, also allows individual group to chart their own course. In other words, it's not just random chance that's resulting in different groups having different experiences. Each group is actively making the dungeon their own. They can retreat, circle around, rush ahead, Go back over old ground, poke around, sneak through, interrogate the locals for secret routes. The possibilities are endless because the environment isn't forcing them along a pre-designed path. And through it all, the players are experiencing the thrill of truly exploring the dungeon complex. By way of comparison, Keep on the Shadowfell is an extremely linear dungeon. So this diagram uses a method laid out by Melon in this post on InWorld. I've got that up as well. You can find a detailed explanation on how to use one of these diagrams. Right over here. And I have that brought up, so I think we might have to go and take a look at this particular type of diagram as well. So this is some type of way to diagram this dungeon. Some would argue that this sort of linear design is easier to run, but I don't think that's actually true to any appreciable degree. In practice, the complexity of a Jaquaying dungeon emerges from the same simple structures that make up a linear dungeon. The room the PCs are currently in has one or more exits. What are they going to do in this room? Which exits are they going to take? In a linear dungeon, the pseudo choices the PCs make will lead them along a predetermined railroad-like route. In a Jaquaying dungeon, on the other hand, the choices the PCs make will have a meaningful impact on how the adventure plays out, but the actual running of the adventure isn't more complex as a result. On the other hand, a railroad-like quality of the linear dungeon is not its only flaw. It eliminates true exploration, the same reason that Lewis and the Clark were explorers, whereas I head down I-95, I'm merely a driver. It can significantly inhibit the player's ability to make meaningful strategic choices. It is, frankly speaking, less interesting and less fun. I'm going to use the Keep on the Shadowfell to show you how easy it is to jackway your dungeons by making a few simple, easy tweaks. All right, let's go to part 2. Has anyone done this before? I suppose Sable Phoenix was the one who brought this up. Okay, fantastic. But has anybody used this technique to create their dungeon? Okay, jackwaying the dungeon. Let's start by taking a look at some basic techniques employed by jackways. Some of these techniques are designed to offer complex geographic relationships out of which meaningful choices naturally arrive. Others are designed to confuse the mapping of the complex, or, even in a game mechanic without player mapping, to confound the general understanding of the complex. The point is not necessarily to create a maze-like environment, but rather to create an environment of sufficient complexity that the hand of the author and the underlying structure of the dungeon environment become obfuscated. Okay, so multiple entrances. Multiple entrances give the PCs an immediate strategic choice as they approach the dungeon complex. Hidden secondary entrances also reward exploration both inside and outside the dungeon, allowing for favorable approaches and quick escapes. In terms of structure, multiple entrances effectively create an additional loop, see below, through the surface above the dungeon. So this is from the Holmes Basic Set 1977. This is Stone Mountain, so I guess is the one that we're going to be analyzing here. Loops. Branching paths in a dungeon allow for choice, but are still functionally linear in their design. In practice, you will follow a branch to its end, backtrack, and then go to a different branch, but each branch still presents a linear experience. Where things get interesting is when you grab a couple of those branches and hook them together into a loop. These loops are the basic building blocks for non-linear dungeons. They provide meaningful strategic and tactical choices, making exploration meaningful and allow PCs to find alternate routes around and through potential threats. Oh, did we? I just realized I don't think we breathed and sipped this morning because I got my drink here. Let's take a break to do that for just 1 second. If you're new here, we often take 20 seconds to focus on breathing, and then everybody's got their favorite drink here or with them. I hope you've got your favorite drink. So let's take a moment to breathe. 2 deep breaths, complete exhales, and then take a sip of your favorite drink. So here we go. And sip. Much better, much better. I knew we missed something this morning. John says, Castle Zagig has this approach down perfectly. My personal expansions follow the same approach, make for a dynamic environment. Micah says, not heard of this term before Sable Phoenix brought it up, but it sounds like I've done some of it. Dynamic environment, multiple routes, etc. General Nut says, this is the type of thing I like to revisit over and over to keep the concepts always in mind. O'Brien says, the nostalgia is real. I remember the first time seeing that map. Oh, Neutromancer has some hot cocoa. Breathe and release. Exactly. Cold diet root beer for me. That works. Whatever your beverage of choice is. Okay, so multiple level connections. If there's only a single route leading to the next level of the dungeon, the complexity of the current level is collapsed into a choke point. But if you introduce multiple connections between dungeon levels, you create a synergy between complex level designs. Just as you create new structural loops by including multiple entrances to the dungeon, each dungeon connection you draw between levels creates new looping paths throughout the dungeon. Just as you create new structural loops by including multiple entrances into the dungeons, each additional connection you draw between levels creates new looping paths through the dungeon. Discontinuous level connections. In a linear design, the levels of a dungeon must proceed in their predetermined order. Level 1 leads to level 2, level 2 leads to level 3, and level 3 leads to level 4. But once you introduce multiple connections between levels, you are free to have some of those connections skip levels. For example, there might be an elevator on level 1 that takes you down to level 3, or a hidden tunnel on level 4 that takes you back to the surface a half a mile from the dungeon's main entrance. Secret and unusual paths. These are fairly explanatory. They reward curiosity and exploration and can also breathe fresh life into areas of the dungeon which have already been traversed. One thing to note is not every secret path needs to take a conventional form of camouflaged doorway. Tunnels that have suffered cave-ins, traps that drop you to lower levels, archaic teleportation systems that must be decoded, rope bridges that cross over caverns that can be explored from below, a submerged bypass connecting two seemingly unrelated lakes. And here, too, you benefit from the non-linear design of the Jaquaying dungeon. Because there are other viable paths for the PCs to explore, you can include truly esoteric, unusual, and flavorful paths that may be missed by the unwary, and therefore appreciated all the more by those who do discover them. Sublevels. Let's go over here to the comments. Oh, hey, Vision. Welcome. Definitely go run a Pathfinder game. If there's an opportunity to play. Go play the game. Absolutely. Zero Theory says, when you're finished, will you say the dungeon was jacked? John, vodka and OJ, not just for breakfast anymore. Vodka and OJ. That sounds like a great thing to have here at the Morning Grind. Freshly opened can of Pepsi, 0 sugar for me. I feel better now. I've got something similar here. Stargate Mind says, I've always used unmarked teleport tiles. It helps the BEG mobilize, and players love to figure them out. Oh, and we got it. Michael also likes teleport tiles. Brian says, the Blue Book box module in Search of the Unknown was very Gygax-like dungeon construction. Very only a mad mage would design this place. So sublevels. The distinction between a level and a sublevel is somewhat arbitrary, but perhaps the defining characteristic of the sublevel is that it departs from the main sequence of the dungeon. It may be smaller than other levels of the dungeon. It may be difficult to reach, or both. As such, sublevels serve as boulevards of discovery or elaborate shortcuts. Divided levels. Similar to the concept of a sublevel is the divided level. While existing within the main sequence of the dungeon, a divided level cannot be completely traversed without going through the levels above or below it. For example, on the second level of the dungeon, one might find 2 staircases, both leading down to the third level. But the third level itself, there's no path which connects the 2 staircases. or if there is such a path, it may be incredibly well hidden or difficult to traverse. Nested dungeons. Nested dungeons are sort of like sublevels or divided levels on steroids. Imagine designing two separate and distinct complexes, but then linking them together at selected locations. For instance, consider the Lost Temple of the Gorgons and the Obsidian Caverns as both being fully developed dungeon complexes, each with multiple levels and sublevels. You could nest the Lost Temple within the Obsidian Caverns by creating two links between the complexes. A long passage on the first level of the former might lead to the third level of the latter. A long passage on the first level of the former might lead to the third level of the latter, and a teleportation pad on the sixth level of the latter might lead to the fifth level of the former. As a practical demonstration of this technique, consider Jaquay's Dark Tower. Okay, Set's Tower and Mitra's Tower. Both Set's and Mitra's Tower are nested in the four primary levels of the dungeon. Both Set's Tower and Mitra's Tower are nested in the four primary levels of the dungeon. Oh, okay. So this is primary dungeon level 1, primary dungeon level 2 here, primary dungeon level 3 and 4. And then we've nested these two different towers within those dungeons. I see. Minor elevation shifts. When the PC comes to a staircase, they may naturally assume they're going up or down a new level of the dungeon. But including minor elevation shifts within the topography of a single dungeon, you can confound their expectations. Here is an example from the Temple of Elemental Evil. Now that part doesn't surprise me right there. So staircases, I guess it depends on what type of staircase. I don't think I would have automatically assumed that an elevation change was a different level of the dungeon. I guess it depends on what type of staircases they are. This probably not. But if you come to a Diablo-like staircase, that, oh, there it is, that's the entrance to the next level. Hello, Moonswan. Oh, good morning. Good morning. Moonswan says, good morning, Heath. Found you recently through HeroQuest, but really been liking the morning grinds. Excellent. Well, I am so glad to have you here. I am very glad to have you here this morning. Welcome. Micah says, I love using Unseen Servant for all manner of manual labor and other tasks that aren't requiring a lot of strength. I'll say it again. I wish I could do that here. Brian says, once upon a time, the role of mapper was important because the adventure would be less about telling a story and more about a location that acted as a puzzle itself. Finding secret rooms and stairs. Yeah, it depends on, we talk about the, or Sable Phoenix brought up games versus the gamist versus simulationist approach versus a narrative approach. And sometimes I don't even know what we're doing anymore. Like I was trying to figure that out with 5th edition, as I said, because I was like, okay, the more I look at 5th edition, the less happy I am with it. Of course, we've been exploring all kinds of things, but like, what is it supposed to be doing? It's not gamist. It's not necessarily narrative. I don't know exactly what it's supposed to be, but yeah, the mapping and exploring seems to be more part of the gamist side, I think. Neutromancer says, Geese, I've been trying to remember a map module that was made of 3 really big wizard towers. I think each tower was basically a sub-dungeon, and maybe there were 1 or 2 sky bridges. I don't know that one. Stairs with maze cast on them can lead to any dungeon level. To lead to any level. Oh. So in addition to short stairways and misleading slopes, you can also include tunnels that loop under each other while technically remaining on the same level of the dungeon. It's also important to think vertically within rooms as well. These techniques aren't just a matter of confusing the player's mapping. They're disrupting their ability to intuit the organization of your maps by analyzing the reality of the game world. While maintaining clean and simple maps for your own use and reference, you're creating a world that not only seems more dynamic and complex, but actually is more dynamic and complex. Basically, don't fall into the trap of thinking that just because your map is two-dimensional, that the world should be two-dimensional. Midpoint entry. I don't think Jackways ever used this technique, but you can complicate the player's approach to the dungeon by creating immediate bilateral exploration. In other words, PCs entering a dungeon are usually only faced with with one navigational question at the macro level. How do we get down to level 2? But if the PCs are instead entering in the middle of the dungeon, what levels above and below, they are faced with a tougher question. Which way do we go? Note that this decision point is similar to the one faced by the PCs who have skipped a level as a result of discontinuities. I don't know why I can't say that word right now. Discontinuous level connection. It is similar to this situation faced by PCs who have taken advantage of a hidden entrance leading to a lower level of the dungeon. The distinction of the midpoint entry is that the expected default entry point. The distinction of the midpoint entry is that it is the expected default entry point of the dungeon. And in classic dungeon arrangements where difficulty corresponds to dungeon level, the difficulty of the dungeon would increase in both directions away from the midpoint entry. Well, that's what I was wondering. So this is the difficulty of the dungeon would increase in both directions. Okay. Neutromancer says, I love dungeons and maps, but don't like running them because of the whole simulationism gaming thing. I prefer just to use theater of the mind, but I like to use them for Minecraft or whatever. Micah says, a blend of all three is best, but 5e unfortunately leans too much to the middle instead of a solid base for all three. Then again, it also has issues with the exploration pillar as a whole, too. And I was thinking about exploration. Of course, if people are talking about exploration, combat, and some kind of interaction, when you're talking about exploration, you could be talking about wilderness exploration and overland travel. But sometimes you're also talking about like actually exploring a specific site. But those are two very different things. This is combat when you're actually at the location trying to go through it. Because to me, exploration as far as overland travel, that's different from exploration is once you've gotten to the site and now trying to figure out what's in it. Zero the Blade says, I treat dungeons as a puzzle to be built. Micah says, I run Theater of the Mind mostly just because attempts to do software for most games are online for me, unfortunately. Ends up taking a lot more time than just doing sketches for myself. Yeah, it's true. It's true. We've talked about that before. We've talked about that quite a bit. That for some reason, for whatever reason that is, some people have expected the online games to be more expecting more out of the online games, and I want to fight that back. And which requires more time to set up. There was also the thing that original D&D dungeons were meant to be strictly dungeon level difficulty. The dungeon level is equal to difficulty level. All right, let's go over here. So non-Euclidean dungeon, non-Euclidean geometry. If you want to have some real fun, consider using non-Euclidean geometry. These Escher-inspired designs can result in counterintuitive navigation and may even result in PCs moving between levels without realizing that it's happened. For instance, in a non-Euclidean design, check out my work on FFG's The Lost Hunt and award-winning Halls of the Mad Mage. Sounds like some Cthulhu stuff there, too. Extra-dimensional spaces. A section of a dungeon complex may lead into areas completely beyond the dungeon itself, while still remaining intimately tied to the dungeon's topography and experience. For example, Module EX1 Dungeonland detailed a Wonderland-inspired demi-plane that could be accessed deep below Castle Greyhawk. I've read about other DMs incorporating the Lost Island of X1, the Island of Dread, in a similar demi-plane with their mega dungeon complex. While such excursions can certainly breathe a little air into a claustrophobic dungeon delve, I think it remains a bit of an open question where the distinction between an extra-dimensional space which belongs to the dungeon and a teleportation effect which simply takes the PCs out of the dungeon entirely lies. In practice, the line between the two is probably more of a blur than an actual demarcation. Laying aside the broader questions, I include extra-dimensional spaces in the list of Jaquaying techniques because they allow you to superimpose multiple areas into a single geographic space. All right, the philosophy of Jaquaying. Neutromancer says some online gaming maps are better for dungeons. Roll20 is based on giant JPEGs, but some are meant to make your maps one square at a time and explored. Yeah, and I've played in them. What the game master has been setting up, like all the digital walls and things like that, to handle line of sight and lighting effects, and all of that's fantastic. But yeah, it just takes so much time. So, Jaquaying the Dungeon Part 3, the philosophy of Jaquaying. There's a temptation to think the complexity arising from the Jaquay's technique as being inherently chaotic, a funhouse dungeon that doesn't make any logical sense. I think some people were just talking about this in the comments a moment ago. But while they are certain that certainly can be true, the reality is that the technique actually results in more realistic designs. For example, consider the layout of my house. Ignoring windows, which effectively turn every room in the house into a potential entry point, the melon diagram looks like this. So we're going to have to look at that diagram in more detail. I tragically don't have much in the way of secret paths, sublevels, or non-Euclidean spaces, but even in this simple structure, we can see multiple midpoint entries and looping paths. I think if you take a moment to consider the architecture of the world around you, you'll discover that linear paths are an exception and not the rule. And yet, how often do we see a D&D module featuring a giant mansion without a window? Because if there are windows, the PCs would be able to break through them and ruin the DM's carefully orchestrated railroad. Nor is this effect limited to man-made structures. Consider, for example, this map of the Robber Baron Cave, complete with hidden passages. Click for a larger image. Okay, so this is Robber Baron Cave, Bexler County, Texas, San Antonio Grotto. Okay, very complex structure here. It's complex to the point of being virtually ungameable, though I take that as a challenge even as I type it. Size. My decidedly non-palatial house also makes the point that dungeons don't have to be large in order to take advantage of Jaquaying. For example, the map I designed for Darkwood Secret only features a dozen locations, but the floor of this dungeon looks like this. Maybe we should go over and take a look at this, because I don't really understand what this diagram looks like. So it might be time to go ahead and go over to that melon diagram. Neutromancer says exactly. That's why I bring up the simpler ones where you just doodle your grid and maps appear, and the software itself can be used to connect, but they're a bit old, like an MRC client. I think it was Map Tool. Yeah, see, well, when I was talking about, I had talked about playing online, and I wanted to be able to do it in a way that I guess was a lot more like theater of the mind. Like the game should facilitate that, so you can connect and play and don't have these ridiculous expectations. That the game masters can spend more time setting that up than they would at the table. Let's go over here, because we're seeing all these diagrams right here, and I don't understand what this is telling me. So let's go over here. Let's go over here to this Jaquaying the Dungeon and Addendum, how to use a melon diagram. So let's look at that. So we're seeing these types of diagrams for our dungeons. And it says, 10 years ago, I wrote Jaquaying a Dungeon, a detailed look at the differences between linear and non-linear dungeons. In this essay, I briefly used what I dubbed melon diagrams, a technique created in 2006 by Melon for a thread on InWorld, where he discussed a map flow and old-school game design. These diagrams are, unfortunately, not immediately intuitive to everyone looking at them, and because I use diagrams in Jaquaying a Dungeon, I'm frequently asked how they're supposed to work. In fact, I've been asked that question on 3 different times in the last week, which brings me to today's post. So that's our question right here. As you can see an example of what a melon diagram looks like at the top of this post. It depicts the first level of the Sunless Citadel. So that is the first level of the Sunless Citadel, according to this diagramming technique. Designed by Bruce Cordell with original cartography by Todd Gamble. And I have played the Sunless Citadel years ago. Today, though, I'll be using Mike Shulley's version of the map from Tales from the Yawning Portal. So what's the point of this thing? Well, as Melon said in his original post, they are a graphical method which distills the dungeon into a kind of decision tree or flowchart by stripping away the noise. On the resulting image, meandering corridors and even smaller room complexes are turned into straight lines. Although the image doesn't create an accurate representation of the dungeon map, and is by no means a scientific depiction, it demonstrates what kind of navigational decisions the player can make while moving through the dungeon. By getting rid of the noise, you can boil a dungeon down to its essential structure. They allow you to compare the structures to different dungeons at a glance. It's fairly important to note that you don't actually use melon diagrams for designing dungeons. They're an analytical tool, not a design tool. Use them to look at something which has already been created, not to create in the first place. Okay, that's interesting. But if you're looking at a diagram, what does it actually mean? How is the noise being stripped out, and what does that tell you? How are you supposed to interpret the diagram or make one yourself? Straighten the line. So the first principle of making a melon diagram is to eliminate all of the irrelevant twists and turns on the map. For instance, consider this path through the Sunless Citadel. Entrance right over here, here, into this room, down this hallway, up, down. All right, so that's the path we're talking about. It looks really interesting, right? It's all kinds of turns. You went through multiple doors. You even reversed direction a couple of times. But as far as the melon diagram is concerned, this is a straight line. Follow a corridor, and when it makes a turn, isn't following a corridor when it makes a turn is not a meaningful navigational choice. Correct. Same thing for going through a door if there's no other exit from the room. So that is true. So we are seeing here that here we've got some uninteresting or irrelevant navigational choices here, because we've got a turn here and a turn here and a turn here. But all of those, that's just following a hallway that takes a turn. So that's not navigationally interesting. And actually the same thing here with this room right here. We're going from this door to that door, but there's only one door in there. So there's no navigational choice. I suppose here as well. This is, I guess, the guard house or something like that that's going over here. So there's no meaningful navigational choice here. But once you get into this room, we do have two. Okay. Whoa. Okay. Fork the path. But wait a minute, you say. In following this path, the PCs did make choices. For example, in that first circular room, the PCs had a choice of two different doors. You're absolutely right. This is exactly what a melon diagram is interested in looking at. On this little chunk of the Sunless Citadel, there are two forking paths. One that can go this way, and one that can go this way. We're seeing that in red here. And so, on a melon diagram, this section would look like this. We've got this black line representing our path through the dungeon here, and then the red lines, which are two forking decision points. The black path is depicted as a straight line, and the alternate paths are shown in red. Melon diagrams typically aren't color-coded like this, since all paths are equally valid. We're only using the colors here for clarity. The length of each branch in the diagram, it should be noted, is roughly proportional to its length in the dungeon. I don't carefully measure this or anything, but you could if you wanted to. In this case, I'm showing them proportional per the section of map we're looking at. We'll see this in a moment. These particular spurs are actually much longer. As we will see in a moment, this particular spur is actually much longer. Eliminate side chambers. So here's another principle that we're going to be looking at right here. Zero Theory says there's some newer things that allow you to build a dungeon in 3D than import it into Foundry. And I started looking at Foundry and it looks amazing, but I haven't gotten into it. Like, you're talking about like things like the Dungeon Alchemist and things like that too. Oh, lots of communication going on over here. All right, let's go on over here. Eliminate side chambers. Wait another minute, you cry. I can see other doors that you're ignoring. The second principle of a melon diagram is that we're going to eliminate all paths that are only one chamber deep. So we could take a chunk of this dungeon right here. So we've got this chunk right here. Because we do have, some, like this door right here goes into this room. This door goes into this room. We got a door that goes over here, and we got this room right here. And draw a diagram like this. So I suppose this down here is probably this up here, this fork of the dungeon. But the reason we don't do this is because such a diagram becomes meaninglessly noisy. We're trying to eliminate noise. That was part of our goal here. Furthermore, these side chambers largely don't represent meaningful navigational choices on the macro level of the entire dungeon. You might choose to bypass such doors, but if you choose to open one of them, the only choice is to go back. The only choice is to go back to the path you are already following. Note that you can actually see this when looking at the diagram. It's immediately apparent that all those little spurs don't really go anywhere. You can argue the same thing is technically true of longer side tracks, but in practice, these longer paths tend to be more meaningful to the overall structure of the dungeon and the experience of playing it. With that said, there's nothing magically relevant about a 1 room versus 2 rooms in a larger dungeon. You might find different thresholds by what constitutes a meaningful sidetrack to be useful. And is there some reason to? I mean, meaningful, I think here is key. Some meaningful, even if you do have to backtrack. Although it seems like if you were Jaquaying this dungeon, you wouldn't want them to have to backtrack. If you go on a meaningful sidetrack that does get you some useful treasure or something like that, don't backtrack. Come up with some other way to get them back into the main loop. You'll similarly want to eliminate very short dead-end hallways if they exist. I'm glad we took this meaningful sidetrack into understanding these diagrams. So, diagrammatic turns. Hey, what's with the turns in your diagram? I thought you said we weren't mapping that sort of thing. That's true. In practice, however, melon diagrams will introduce superfluous 90-degree turns in order to keep the diagrams relatively compact or to conveniently make room for other paths. So if you see a turn on a melon diagram that doesn't have a second path branching from it, you'll know it's purely cosmetic. It doesn't actually reflect a turn in the dungeon, and although the turn in our current example sort of resembles a turn in the dungeon itself, such turns in the diagram may be present even when there are no turns in the corresponding dungeon tunnel. Eliminate fake loops. Dungeon paths will, of course, form loops. In fact, a well-designed Jaquay dungeon will probably feature lots of loops, ignoring routes that branch off from the loop for the moment. Here is one. Okay, ignoring routes that branch off from the loop for a moment. Here is one from the Sunless Citadel. So here is a loop through this dungeon. On the melon diagram, it would look like this. You come into the loop, and then you go around this loop. But what about this loop? Okay, right there. That's okay, over here. It's being shown. It's not on that one all the way. What about that loop? Well, on a melon diagram, this would actually be depicted as a straight line. To understand why, let's start by eliminating the side chambers. Viewed like this, you'll clearly see that this is not a true navigational loop. It's a fake fork. The navigational choice is a false one. After eliminating the side chambers, both paths lead immediately to the exact same place. Oh, okay, I see. This one up here has rooms in the center, so you can go into the rooms. But if you don't, you just block those out. Does it really, if you're trying to get to this room with the throne and the pillars in it, both choices go to the same place. Secret paths. When a path like this one goes through a secret door, it is indicated with a dotted line on a melon diagram. Okay, so dotted lines mean secret doors. Note that the other secret doors are not represented here because they lead to side chambers, which are eliminated regardless. Level connections. I was wondering what that was. The last functional element of the melon diagram are the connections between levels. When a path goes from one level of the dungeon to another by stair, elevator, sloping ramp, teleporter, or whatever, this is indicated by a break in the line with terminating lines on other side. So that means level change. Melon diagrams may also include labels. Goblins, secret lab, teleportation trap. These are technically non-functional parts of the diagram and can be useful to help orient readers themselves. Some melon diagrams of long linear dungeons will be split into multiple columns, each with connections between the column being indicated by a dotted line with an arrow. This is sometimes confused for a secret door, but it's really just a tool for keeping the diagram relatively compact. If you're reading this and still scratching your head over what the point of any of this stuff is supposed to be or what relevance the elements depicted by a melon diagram are supposed to have, I'm going to do a full loop here and return you back to Jaquaying the dungeon, which is designed as an introduction to the sort of basic dungeon design technique that the diagrams are supposed to demonstrate. Okay, so now that we understand that, here, size, my decidedly non-palatial house, also makes the point that dungeons don't have to be large in order to take advantage of Jaquaying. For example, the map I designed for Darkwood's Secret only featured a dozen locations, but the flow of the dungeon looks like this. So I guess you come in here. So every fork should be a meaningful navigational choice. So we're not doing red and black here. I guess this is probably supposed to be telling us what rooms like are mapped on our key over here. So this is showing a bunch of different loops here. And this is supposed to be a secret passage, which I suppose gets us to 12. Let's see, Neutromancer says, I would only do this for one-shot nostalgia purposes probably, or to see what it used to feel like. One room does have 2 connections, though. Talking about the philosophy of our diagramming this. I think I get where he's going with this. But the smaller scale actually highlights the gameplay impact of non-linear dungeon designs. It becomes very easy to see the many different ways in which the dungeon can be played. Can certain dangers be avoided? Will the PCs of the monsters determine the field of engagement? Will there be where will reinforcements be coming from? What viable lines of defense can be held? Beware of the sprawl. None of this, however, is to say that you should never use branching paths or create choke points for accessing the lower points of a dungeon, any more than is to say that every single means of egress should be secret or unusual. It's merely to say that such features should be used to effect and not simply by default. Variety is the spice of dungeon design, after all. It's also important to realize that there really can be too much of a good thing. There is a point in which endless loops and countless connections within the dungeon result in meaningless choice instead of meaningful choice. In Jaquaying your dungeon, it's important to beware of featureless sprawl of ever-looping corridors. Well, I think that would be interesting to formalize. This line right here. There is a point at which endless loops and countless connections within the dungeon result in meaningless choice instead of meaningful choice. Structure in the dungeon. A comprehensive guide to effective dungeon design is beyond the scope of this essay, but there are a couple of useful barometers you can use in the process of Jaquaying. Difficult versus easy. Look at your map. There should be areas of the dungeon which are difficult to reach and areas which are easy to reach. By saying this, I'm not specifically referring to isolated secret rooms, although there's nothing wrong with these, but rather with large sections of the dungeon. In making this assessment, you are diagnosing whether you've made the dungeon too boring or making the choice of path through the dungeon irrelevant. You want the dungeon to benefit from being interconnected, but if everything in the dungeon trivially connects to everything else, then navigation becomes meaningless. I suppose that's the point right there. If everything in the dungeon trivially connects to everything else, then navigation becomes meaningless. The grid exploration, where players make their own map. Got it. Stargate Mind says, I think of the spells that made the dungeon, not who dug the dungeon out. That's the fun perspective that incorporates all of this. Dangerous Encounters. Welcome, Dangerous Encounters. Good to see you here on the Morning Grind. Dangerous Encounters says, I take 7 dice, throw them on a piece of paper, then design my dungeon according to my imagination. I've seen that done on a couple of different map-making techniques. Either throwing out dice. Did we cover a technique like that on the Morning Grind? I can't remember if we looked at that or not. Or if it was just something that I was reading elsewhere, where somebody was using... Well, no, I think it might have been. But throwing dice and then mapping around the dice. I've also seen people who were making a larger map for a fantasy world that they used it by putting rice down on a big map and then moving around the rice and then tracing out the rice. Neutromancer says the original Red Box DM's Guide Bargle's Castle map had a bunch of loops, both the house above and the dungeon below. Far versus near. Similarly, have the interconnections major dungeon too shallow. Look at where PCs can be entering the dungeon. I still think this could definitely be formalized. They're probably through, I have to think about that. Because I was thinking about dungeon generation. Particularly automated dungeon generation or algorithmic dungeon generation. Because you can go online and you can get, random dungeon generators. I mean, those have been online forever. And if you need a dungeon map, you can get one. Now, the question is, and I've actually seen different algorithms for the generation of a dungeon. But this seems like something that you should be able to control in a dungeon generation algorithm. Its level of interconnectedness. Because I've seen the algorithmic generation of the dungeon where it was probably not considering any of this. I've seen several different techniques, and they're all pretty interesting. But I'd be interested to know then, okay, if you randomly generate the dungeon, you get through that type of algorithm, then can you evaluate it, again, algorithmically, according to the principles outlined here that have been formalized, and then reject some dungeons and just come up with the ones that are the most interesting, and probably incorporate stuff from that cyclical dungeon design too. I think that'd be really interesting. So far versus near. Similarly, have the interconnections major dungeon too shallow. Look at where the PCs will be entering the dungeon. There should be areas of the dungeon which feel far away from these entrances. If everything in the dungeon feels equidistant, break some of those connections or delve a little deeper into your design. Note that near and easy to reach portions of the dungeons aren't problems to be eliminated. When you look at what you're looking for is an effective balance in the mix between all four of these design elements. Difficult, easy, far, and near. Landmarks. Finally, the complexity of connections within a properly Jaquaying dungeon can also leave the players feeling somewhat adrift. In some cases, this can be taken advantage of. In other cases, it's a problem that needs to be solved. I started map development by literally copying and pasting a large chunk of alpha-based ruins into one corner of the map. This established a particularly unique landmark in the corner. These large landmarks in the skirmish map help players immediately know where they are and let them navigate from point to point by in-game visual references. Ideally, each corner of any skirmish map is visually unique, and that was my goal design with Terminal Moraine, Janelle Jaquay's Terminal Moraine design notes. Different context, but Jaquay's provides the solution once again. In order to successfully navigate a dungeon, the players will need distinct, memorable landmarks to orient themselves. If you're designing a dungeon with lots of unique, interesting features, this problem will generally take care of itself. The players will glom onto whatever details particularly resonate with them and use those details to guide themselves. On the other hand, it can never hurt to do a quick pass on your design and add a few deliberate landmarks, a large bloodstain, a unique statue, a room with strange runes. Of course, players may provide their own landmarks. Hey, that's the ogre we killed last week. Awesome. On the other hand, you may also be able to use landmarks to mess with your players. Some landmarks could easily disappear. An ogre's corpse that gets dragged away by scavengers. Those unreliable landmarks can then open up the question of how missing a landmark should be interpreted. The runes are missing. Does that mean we're in a different room, or have the runes vanished? And some landmarks which might seem unique could easily prove otherwise. There's the golden statue of a cyclops in a hexagonal room. Or hexagonal room. But I thought that was the other side of the complex. Did we get turned around? To flip around one last time, particularly crafty DMs might be able to hide reliable navigation information into seemingly unreliable landmarks. Let's see. We've been going for about an hour here, but I think there's only a little bit more here to go. So I want to continue to go through Jaquaying. I don't know that we want to split this one up into multiple days. So I'm going to keep going here. I got a little bit of time. Like I said, I'm going to spend my day cleaning and doing yard work and stuff like that. But let's take a few more minutes to continue this. This is very interesting. I thought this was a really interesting topic here. So Jaquaying the Keep of the Shadowfell. Okay, so this is our example right here. Shadowfell Keep level 1. I don't know this one. Shadowfell Keep level 2. This is the complete map of the Keep of Shadowfell, taken from the Adventures of the same name. The red arrow indicates the dungeon's entrance. So we are entering here. Okay, and this staircase leads to over there. The black arrow indicates the connection between level 1 and level 2 of the dungeon. At first glance, this dungeon may appear to be quite complex and interesting. There are a lot of twisting corridors, and the PCs appear to be given an immediate and meaningful choice of 3 separate corridors upon entering the dungeon. But as I mentioned earlier, when you straighten all of these out with twisting corridors, the overwhelmingly linear structure of the dungeon becomes quite clear. So we have the entrance here. Oh, we have the entrance. Remember, that's the mark of a separate level. So I guess that's the goal or something like that. Calariel, I suppose, a person here. So the entrance. So this does show you. Okay, so it does show you basically you're going straight to the person. The only legitimate interesting feature of this dungeon from a cartographical standpoint is the loop of encounters in areas 1 through 4. Or maybe instead of cartographical, maybe navigational. The only legitimate interesting feature of this dungeon from the navigational standpoint, maybe 1 to 4. I can't make this larger. Here is 4, though. 1, the loop between 1 and 4. Here is 3 over here. Maybe that's 2. Everything else in the dungeon has been designed to proceed in an essentially predetermined fashion. The DM sets up the encounter, the PCs knock them down, and then the DM sets up the next encounter. What I'm going to do is take a few simple Jaquaying techniques and use them to tweak the Keep of the Shadowfell in order to make them more dynamic and interesting dungeon. By changing the macro structure of the dungeon, we'll be able to unlock the full potential of the local interest of the map, all the twisting corridors and mini loops and encounters themselves. To do this, I'm going to suggest making 4 slight adjustments to the dungeon's design. Okay, this is interesting. Oh, KJ. Hello, KJ. Good to see you. It says that was a 4th edition adventure map. Okay, I skipped 4th edition. I wasn't gaming at the time, so that's probably why I don't know it. I think you were right, 03. So Cyclical Dungeon was about designing from scratch. This seems all about modifying old or already existing maps. But that's why I was thinking that if you were doing some of the dungeon generation techniques, the algorithmic ones, that you could probably use these techniques to evaluate which ones are good and which ones are not, and which ones can be improved by what type of changes. So I think that is correct. But in the beginning, we talked about the diagramming stuff. You've got to already have a dungeon to go on. But in the beginning of the Jaquaying stuff, we talked about the stuff that was, we talked about good design. Pauper Knight. Hello, Pauper Knight. Good to see you. Welcome. Pauper Knight says, I would argue that if you have an idea for what the structure's original intended use was, then making it too disconnected and patternless defeats the intent of the original builder. Pauper Knight says, particularly if it was intended for defense or a living space, like a keep at one time. Well, yeah, I suppose at some point, if we have the narrative reason for it, the structure's original intended use, and then you start doing some weird stuff to it, people are going to be expecting it to adhere to some type of I get distracted. So, yeah, people are expecting it to adhere to some type of logic because of what its intended use was. Although, I suppose there are all different kinds of different creative ways that you could make this happen, especially if the structure is degraded or aged, or things have happened to it from its original one. Jaquaying is also a manual process. Cyclical is an algorithm for a randomizer. Neutromancer says. James says, could that not be said of any element within a game? Possibly. Okay, so to do this, 4 slight adjustments to this keep's design. Second entrance. As described on my original remix of the keep on the Shadowfell, add a second entrance to the dungeon. About half a mile to the west of the keep, up in the foothills of the Cairngorms, there's a natural cave that leads more or less directly to Area 10 of the keep. This is how the Cuthricks and the rats got into Areas 9 and 10. As described in the Remix PDF, the PCs can discover this entrance either by scouting the area around the keep or by researching it in Lord Padraig's library in Winterhaven. If this entrance is found before the PCs enter the keep, it's a nice reward for their cleverness and preparation. If it's found during their exploration of the keep, it can provide a valuable avenue of escape or allow them to sneak back into the complex after a guard has been raised at the primary entrance. Adding a staircase. Add a staircase leading from the torture room, Area 2, to the antechamber of Sir Keegan's tomb, Area 7. My primary motivation here is to remove some of the dead ends from the dungeon. By linking 2 of the dead ends together, I'm creating a dynamic loop. So I'm at 2 and 7. If we can see here. This is 7. I'm not sure where 2 is. That might actually be 3 right there. No, that's 3. I guess that's got to be 2. Connect 2 and 7? Difficult to tell. But anyway, the point here was that we were adding a staircase here to create a dynamic loop. Note, however, that I'm actually linking the loop in just before the actual dead end of Sir Keegan's tomb in Area 8. I wish I could see this better. Okay. Yeah, so this is 7. So the tomb is actually back here in 8. We're linking something about 10, about 2, but it must be over here. Do people see what I'm talking about? Maybe if you've got the book, so you understand that a bit better. Okay, so note, however, that I'm actually linking the loop in just before the actual dead end of Sir Keegan's tomb in Area 8. This is partially due to the internal logic of the adventure. It doesn't make any sense for a hallway to pass straight through Keegan's tomb, but it's also practical in terms of design. By leaving the branch into Area 8 intact, we're providing a flavorful navigational choice to PCs entering Area 7. Adding a secret passage. Add a secret passage leading from Area 6 to Area 15. From Area 6 to Area 15. Area 6 right here to Area 15, so that's down. That might be Area 15. Area 6. So again, but again, it looks like we're working with a dead end here. So instead, staircase there, 6 to 15. Pauper Knight says, of course, but randomly creating a dungeon complex likes to remove the original use or purpose by just randomly scattering rooms and corridors throughout. Well, you know, that makes me wonder, could you, like, what are the features, like what are our main types of dungeon categories? So rather than a just completely random generation, are there certain rules that an algorithm should follow if you're talking about a defensive keep versus a natural cavern? Like, what are those rules? And then, so that you do have a bit more of that expectation. All right, so we're not just a random, because like that's why another reason why I don't like just generally random encounters. Here's a completely random dungeon for you. Well, and you say, hey, it's a castle. That may not make any sense. Pauper Knight says, I like to start with the question of why was this used? What was this used for when it was created? It helps in the concept. Yeah, I agree. So like quest and task linking and what am I building? So that makes me like, could we come up with, I wonder what like the 4 major types of dungeons are. Okay, so adding a secret passage. This provides a second connection to the lower level, providing the dungeon with important multiple connections between levels. By properly positioning these connections, we can turn entire dungeon levels into looping structures. Moving a staircase. Move the staircase leading from area 12. Okay. From area 5 to area 3. Move the staircase leading to area 12 from area 5 to area 3. Area 3 is over here. The primary reason for the shift is to open up some real estate between the primary and secondary routes leading to the lower level. Okay. Admittedly, this is a problem that only exists because of where I chose to put the secret passage. But this also allows the goblins to reach the lower levels without passing through undead-infested halls, thus correcting a problem with the original dungeon's design. And by hooking a level connector into the far end of the adventure's original loop, we're laying the complexity of the dungeon's cartography. Finally, in order to make these changes fit into a natural logical geography, I've simply inverted the entirety of areas 6 through 8. With this change, these areas, which were originally a minor elevation shift requiring the PCs to descend a staircase from area 1, become a true second level to the complex, passing directly beneath areas of the first level. So let's see if we can see what's going on here. Level 1 is highlighted in red. The new level 2 is highlighted in blue. And level 3, the original second level, is now in green. Okay. So, we started with a linear dungeon. But after Jaquaying, the result is this. Well, this does look much more interesting. So remember, these are our level connections. Areas 12 through 17 are on this path. So our entrance is here, and also an entrance is here. Going through areas 9 to 11, change of elevation, a change of level, because that's that other area that we added. Getting back into the main dungeon loop. Entrance, going down a level to 6 to 8. Okay, well, I mean, this looks so much. This is the dotted line is that secret passage that takes you from this level of the dungeon from area 6 to 8 down to this one. Note that we haven't changed the actual key to the adventure. We're just restructured the environment around which those encounters are placed. I've also prepped some detail light maps to make the changes a little clearer. You'll want to cross-reference these with maps of the original module. The original level 2, which is now level 3, is unchanged, so I didn't remap it. Okay. I'll take a moment to note this isn't the only way that we could have done this. Other things we could have done. Put a secret door at the bottom of the pit trap in Area 1, leading to one of several possibilities on the second tunnel. Have the Kurthrix tunnel from Area 10 down to Area 15. Put a teleport in Sir Keegan's tomb keyed to a matching crypt on the second level. One of the prisoners in the torture chamber dug a hidden escape tunnel leading to an Area 6, where he was killed by zombies, the poor bastard. Could there be a connection between the pool in Area 11 and the water-based trap in Area 16? Could the access to Area 15 north of Area 16 be a secret door with a more obvious entrance leading from Area 17, allowing meticulous PCs to potentially bypass the trap? The particular revisions I've made simply struck me as either the most interesting or the most appropriate or both. But the point of performing this revision on the Keep of the Shadowfell is not only to salvage another aspect of this adventure. My primary goal is to demonstrating how easy it is to implement these techniques in your own dungeons. If we take an existing linear dungeon and fundamentally transform it in a couple of minutes using a handful of Jaquaying techniques, then the effect could be even more dramatic if we were to design a dungeon from the ground up using these techniques. Here's a quote from the recent interview with Janelle Jax over Grognardia. The core inspirations for Castle Thracia were threefold. The first was to ally the various beast races in AD&D as a unifying force. The second was to build encounters that took place on multiple levels of a cave, where the upper areas were situated above the lower areas. The final inspiration that I remember was rather primitive, but unique plate armor used by Mycenaean soldiers. This became human guards in the upper reaches of the caverns. A particular interest here is Jaquay's second inspiration. I can personally testify to the effectiveness of these open caverns in transforming the typical dungeon crawling experience. They immediately force the players to think in 3 dimensions, while their ubiquity significantly contributes to the memorable layout of the dungeon. So what was the second one? The second was to build encounters that took place in multiple levels of the cave, where the open upper areas were situated above lower areas. So I guess that's what we were seeing right here. But the important revelation to be had here, in my opinion, is the effectiveness of clearly delineating a small list of concrete goals before designing your dungeon. Building on that point, notice that Jaquay's only specifies a single non-linear design technique in her list of creative goals. And it's actually a very specific variation of the generalized technique. And although it's not the only non-linear technique employed in the Caverns of Thracia, Jaquay's riffs on the theme are a different aspect of the module. Here's my point. Earlier in the series, I listed a dozen Jaquaying techniques. Next time you design your dungeon, don't feel like you need to cram them all in. Instead, pick 1 or 2 of them and explore it in as many ways as possible while you're designing the dungeon. If you want a more focused experience, follow Jaquay's example and try to narrow your design theme down to a specific variant of one technique, like a multi-level caverns. Here are a specific form of unusual level connectors. Jaquaying your dungeon is easy. It's also fun, and this applies to both the designing of the dungeon and playing of the dungeon. Nothing is more exciting to me than as a GM than to sit down at the table and know that I'm going to be just as surprised by my players as I hope that my players are by me. And when it comes to dungeon design, that's a unique and exciting experience that Jaquaying unlocks. So addendum, dungeon level connections, Jaquaying on the small scale, how to use a melon diagram, we looked at that, and dark tower level connections. But I think that basically gets us the entire approach to this theory. I'm glad we looked at this. I'm glad Sable Phoenix brought that up. I haven't seen Sable Phoenix in the comments, but I'm very glad that this came up. So let's see. Neutromancer says the idea that some monsters would have no way to navigate without having to fight other monsters also makes sense to me. To correct. Lots of dungeons are just random encounters without thought. Pauper Knight says that's when you create monsters that are either factions or allies or simply territorial over their span of the dungeon. Correct, but unallied monsters blocking other monsters to moving around. Yeah, it makes the dungeon nonsensical, right? Okay, well, this was another fantastic conversation. I thought this went really well. I do want to put the link. If you are new here and you have found your way here, I don't think that I ever actually put the link to the Ravenkeep web server, Ravenkeep Discord server. So let me drop that link in the chat right there. So if you are here, please do come and join the Ravenkeep server. It would be great to have you, and I really hope to see you on more of the morning grind. I got to figure out what our topic for tomorrow is going to be. We could look at Kobold Press stuff that's come out. I don't know. Also, but Lamentations, the Flame Princess keeps coming up, so I'll have to check on that. Or the Psionics book. Maybe I can get my office cleaned up in here a bit while like I said, I'm doing physical cleaning and yard activity and house cleaning today. So maybe I can get the desk cleaned up here so we can return to doing some physical unboxings and physical readings as well. That would be great. I do want to go over the He-Man book over here. So all of that's going on. I am going to be out of touch for the rest of the day because, like I said, I am getting away from the computer today and cleaning and doing stuff. I hope that you have a very creative day. I hope that you have a productive day. I hope that you enjoy yourself, or hey, go and see one of the movies. We will talk about them later. So hope everybody has a great day. I will talk to everybody tomorrow. Later.